The contribution margin per unit for product A is $25, and the firm's fixed cost of production up to 500 units is $400,000. The degree of operating leverage at 300,000 units is closest to. Let's bring in our degree of operating leverage formula. We're given all the variables we need here to solve this. So our contribution margin is going to be equal to this 300,000 units, and then we're multiplying that by the number of units, which is 25. This could go up in this numerator as well, but we just have it down here. And then in our denominator, then we're going to have that same portion, 25 times 300,000, and then you subtract out the fixed costs. And fixed costs we have at 400,000 for up to 500,000 units. So since we're under that, we have that 400,000 number that we can use. And so if this was 200,000 or 400,000 or 500,000 units, this variable is going to stay the same no matter what, but these two would change. So when we work that through, we get degree of operating leverage of 1.056, which if we round that, we get closest to answer C. An analyst working in the corporate finance department of Alpha Zone Corporation is trying to estimate the optimal capital structure for his firm. Exhibit 1 outlines the firm's most important financial information, critical parameters, and Exhibit 2 shows the firm's debt schedule. So we have all this financial information here in the debt schedule. If the company plans to maintain a debt to equity ratio of 0.8, then the firm's weighted average cost of capital will be closest to. So we're given cost of debt. This is going to be pretty straightforward here. So we're going to be using the 6% number since we're looking at debt to equity of 0.8. However, we will need to adjust that for the tax rate to get after-tax cost of debt. So that's going to be pretty straightforward. This one is going to be a big multi-step process for calculating the beta because we're going to be using CAPM, but we're not given the equity beta, we're given asset beta. So let's pull in the formulas and we'll start walking through all the different calculations we're going to have to do here. And I would just say on the exam, you're probably not going to get something that asks you to calculate all these different steps, but this will be helpful to go through because you could certainly get a question asking about certain parts of this. So our equity beta, which is what we would use in CAPM for our calculation, is going to be equal to asset beta, which we are given at 0.85. And then essentially what we're wanting to do here is we need to adjust that for our debt to equity ratio. So we're going to do 1 plus 1 minus t, t being the tax rate of 30%. We can see all this plugged in right down here, directly below. And then we're multiplying by our debt to equity ratio. And again, that was given at 0.8. So we work all this math through and we get an equity beta of 1.326. So then from here to calculate our cost of equity, we're going to be using CAPM, which is this formula right here. So we've got our risk-free rate, and then we're adding to that our beta of 1.326, which we just calculated, and then we're multiplying that by the market risk premium. So the market risk premium is given at 4%. And when we work that through, we get cost of equity of 7.304. So from here then, we're calculating our cost of debt here. So it's going to be our rate, 6%, and then we're adjusting that for the tax rate, so 1 minus 30%. So we work that through, and that gets us a cost of debt of 4.2%. So we've got cost of debt of 4.2%, cost of equity of 7.3. The last thing we need to do is we need to figure out what our weighting is for these actual debts. So for the debt to equity ratio, we're not having 80% debt in our capital structure. We're having 80% debt relative to the amount of equity. So we need to do debt relative to assets and equity relative to assets to understand our debt versus equity weighting. Our debt and equity ratings. So to calculate that, equity is going to be 1, and then in our denominator, we're going to do 1 plus 0.8, because when we have a debt to equity ratio, essentially we're saying we have 0.8 in debt, 0.8 units in debt and then 1 unit in equity, which is what makes up this formula. So we got 1 over 1.8 to get our equity value, and then you can just do 1 minus this value to get your debt, or you could do 0.8 over 1.8. Either works. So then these are going to get applied down here to our final weighted average cost of capital calculation. We take this weighting, multiply it by our cost of equity, which we calculated up here. Then we're going to add that to our debt weighting, multiplied by the after-tax debt cost, which was calculated up here. And that gets worked through, and we get 5.93%. Answer C. Which of the following is least likely an assumption of Modigliani-Miller? So we've got least likely, meaning 2 of these will be assumptions and 1 is not. And remember, this theorem is basically another market efficiency related theorem. And so with that in mind, let's dig into these answers. We've got A, investors have homogeneous expectations. This will be a assumption of Modigliani-Miller. And essentially it implies that investors have the same expectations as far as future risk and return of different assets and asset classes. And that's essentially needed to assume that a market is efficient. Because if investors have different expectations on risk and return, they're going to be investing in different types of assets. B, investors lend and borrow money at a fixed rate. The key here that's going to make this incorrect and likely our answer is this fixed rate portion. It assumes that investors can lend and borrow money at the risk-free rate, but that risk-free rate can float and change over time. And so it's not going to be at a fixed rate, it'd be at the risk-free rate for this to be an assumption. And so C, we should be able to rule out financing and investment decisions are independent of each other. And this is going to be an assumption of Modigliani-Miller, essentially that investors are making decisions, not necessarily that they're interconnected and intertwined, but they are making one-off decisions that are independent. Answer B. Mehmet Kali is a project analyst at Excel Investments. He's analyzing 2 independent projects, A and Z, and independent meaning they don't depend on one another. Like, I don't have to do project A in order to then complete project Z or vice versa. Both projects have positive net cash flows, but project A's cash flow is greater than project Z. Which project should Kali most likely accept? So we've got project Z, project A, or projects A and Z. So because they're independent, we can do one or the other or both. And since they both have positive net cash flows, assuming we don't have an investment constraint, if they have the money to do both these projects, we should do both since they both have positive cash flows. If the answer stated that we had a cash constraint and we could only do one of the projects, then we would obviously want to choose project A. But since they're both positive net cash flows, we want to be able to do both if we can. Answer C. The CFA Institute Code of Ethics most appropriately requires members and candidates to A, encourage others to practice ethically and professionally to reflect credit on the profession. That sounds like it could definitely be our answer. I'm going to circle A for now. B, ensure the preservation of capital market integrity is given priority over protecting employer interest. You could probably make the case for this, but I don't think the code necessarily says we need to give this priority over having loyalty to our employer. And this is a gray area situation here. So I would lean towards A still being the better answer. C, use reasonable care and judgment to achieve and maintain independence and objectivity in their professional activities. We're going to rule this one out as well. A is going to be our best answer. This is going to be more so based on a specific standards of conduct and how we should act in our profession, whereas the code of ethics portion is going to be more focused on the profession and what's mentioned here in A. Answer A. Chantal Pierre owns a large investment fund in Swami, a country with an emerging market. She is Swami's largest dealer of developed market equities. When Pierre places a buy order for her fund, the price of developed market equities significantly rises, prohibiting many local investment funds from purchasing the securities. Similarly, when Pierre places a sell order, equity prices significantly decline. In this way, Pierre always manages to obtain the best price for her transactions. Many traders have complained that Pierre is exploiting her position in developed market equities and that her fund's frequent trades have significantly increased equity market volatility over the past year. Are Pierre's actions in violation of the CFA Institute Standards of Professional Conduct? We've got no, yes, she is front-running the fund's trades, or yes, she is manipulating the market using her dealer. There's nothing to indicate that she's front-running. It says she's the largest dealer, and when she's placing a buy order from her fund. Front-running would indicate that she's placing a personal order in front of the fund, or she knows somebody else is about to trade on this, so she's front-running their trades. I would say there's no indication of that. So between manipulating the market and no, I would lean towards this as no. There is obviously some price movement here that is happening because of this. However, this is more so just a function of them being the largest dealer. And for there to be market manipulation, there needs to be some mention of intent. So in here, we would have had to see Pierre is doing this intentionally to drive up the prices or drive down the prices. But this sounds like it's just a function of them being the largest dealer. If there's no intent to manipulate the market, then there's no violation. Answer A. Which of the following is the least severe disciplinary sanction that the designated officer may take as a result of an investigation? We've got public censure, suspension of the CFA designation, or revocation of the CFA designation. So we're going to go with A as the least severe. Suspension, so this would go order 1, 2, 3, 3 being most severe, and then 1 being the least severe. Public censure is basically just expressing disapproval of someone or something they've done, but that would be kind of a first step. Suspension and revocation are going to be worse than that, more severe. Answer A. Sandra Filner works for a firm that's been actively managing investments since 2009. She serves on a team whose charge is to prepare GIPS compliant presentations for 2016. In researching which investment accounts to include in her firm's calculation, she chooses the best performing index funds for the previous 7 years. Does Filner's decisions most likely lead to GIPS compliance for her firm's upcoming presentation? So to be GIPS compliant, we can't only choose the best performing funds. We need to include all investment funds that we're essentially managing. So I'm going to say we are not compliant here, and we've got no, and yes. So we can rule out C. Now we just need to choose no for the right reason. So we've got no, Filner chose only the best performing index funds to include in her firm's calculations. That sounds like it should be our answer. Then B, no, Filner must include at least 10 years worth of composite results in order to be GIPS compliant. We can rule that out. It'd be nice for them to have 10 years, but they just started, or they're preparing for 2016, and they've only been managing money for this 7-year period. And so they can still be GIPS compliant even without the 10 years. Since they've only been in business for 7. But the main reason here is the inclusion of only best performing funds. That's not going to fly. Answer A. To comply with the Global Investment Performance Standards, verification is voluntary and must be performed by a third party. That sounds like it's our answer. Verification is voluntary, and you can't do this internally. It has to be done by some third party firm. B, we've got obligatory, which is not correct, and must be performed by a third party. That part's correct. But obligatory, again, incorrect, and must be performed by a third party. Answer A. Chris Hines works for a brokerage company. On Tuesday, one of his analysts mails all investors a recommendation to buy the stock of AERD. The following day, Hines receives a call from one of his clients to sell AERD at market price. So this is contrary to the recommendation they just made. What should he most likely do? Should he A, accept the order, B, not accept the order because it's contrary to the firm's recommendation? We can't do that. The client is dictating what you do as the broker, and so you can't just refuse the order. And so we have accept, or C, advise the customer of the change in recommendation before accepting the order. That's definitely going to be our best step. We shouldn't not mention it to them and just accept the order, and we can't refuse the order. So the best thing is to let them know the change that we made and make sure they still want to proceed. Answer C.